So we've got our live stream is going to appear on YouTube in just a sec. And once that is done, we can live stream onto the website. 2 seconds.
Very clever.
I know the wonders of technology. Here we are across corners of the UK, beaming into people's living rooms. And I think they should have caught up with us by now. So hello to everyone, whether you are in your living rooms or bedrooms or on a bus or watching this in days to come. Thank you for joining us for the Lighthouse launch of Wonder Woman. I can't believe I'm holding a physical copy of the book straight from the printers, and that I get to share in this space with Alexandra Blanchard and Alex Howlett. Alex and Alex, hello. I'm Mairie from Lighthouse, and I'm going to just read the short and sweet biographies, and then we're going to dive into this incredibly beautiful and expansive book and unpick it. And then you will have a chance to ask some questions and have those answered. So feel free to stick those in the chat, either on the YouTube feed or on the website. And it's just below our lovely faces. So to just introduce our two speakers, Alexandra Blanchard is a writer, teacher, and host of the podcast, The Grand Thunk. And Alex Howlett is currently a reporter with Al Jazeera Investigative Unit and previously wrote for the Financial Times. They are, hello and welcome. Everyone at home, you can cordially put your hands together. You are the co-authors and the collectors of stories that have made it into the incredibly beautiful Wonder Woman, which is one of the most exciting books that I have read as a bookseller that I have seen come out in 2022. And I'm thrilled to end the year on a high note. And I'm just collecting my best books of 2022. And this one made it just in time for that, because it is rare to come across a book that is so broad in its scope without losing any of the heart and the humanity. And I think it will be impossible for people to read this without coming out the other side with a more profound understanding of the human experience and what connects us all. And also there's these hardships that are so deliberately hidden from the world. So just to get us started, to give our audience a sense of the book and the ground that it covers, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what's in the book and how you two came to write this particular book, which has such an interesting approach to borders and such an inclusive approach to gender.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you so much. I'm so flattered. Yeah, well, we're not, as you said, we're not so much authors as collectors of other people's stories. These are stories that we've collected over the course of about 5 years of just talking to people, and they're the stories of cis women, trans women, and non-binary people from all over the world. There is quite a UK focus because we are UK based, and the story breaks down, this collection of stories breaks down ideas of geographical borders, so stories of refugees, asylum seekers. And with that, we tried to make it as broad as possible. So we've got stories ranging from World War II, stories of people that have been in refugee camps for 45 years, people that have just come to the UK, but then opened up those ideas of borders into the more insidious, invisible borders in our world. If there are steps, if you're a wheelchair user, how can you get down the street? If you identify as trans, how will that change the airport experience for you? And so, yeah, we're just trying to open up those conversations about borders and bring together in the most intersectional way that we could these stories and try and parallel unlikely pairings of stories. And I really feel like it does try to bring a lot of personality and a lot of humanity to these like situations we've heard a lot about, like Syria, for example, but then yeah, also just telling stories. Sorry, I got lost there at the end.
No, that was great.
I think adding to that is kind of the like process of how we reached this kind of format for the book. It didn't really start off like this at all. It was literally just Hearst, Lara, who's editor at Hearst. I reached out for an internship years ago, and she was like, no, we don't do internships. But I was doing kind of campaign stuff with Women of Western Sahara and helping organize events. And they are just incredible, these Sahrawi politicians, and they have this quite, what I thought, unique position in Sahrawi society. It's kind of the women really occupy a prominent space within politics and activism. And so it's kind of starting with like, well, that could be an interesting book. And at the same time, Alex was working with and supporting Syrian refugees in Dorset, where she currently lives. And we had this conversation about the women Alex was helping in Dorset. And then I was talking about the Sahrawi women I was meeting. And we realized that that kind of like comparison of their experiences revealed some kind of more interesting nuances. And then we just didn't stop introducing new people. Or it was, I mean, honestly, it's been quite random how the stories we've included have developed. It's from the people we've met, or kind of come across on even like social media and being like, oh, they seem really interesting. And it's not until we've recorded the interviews, transcribed them, and then placed them alongside the other interviews we've already done that we understand the kind of parallels, despite the fact that they seem kind of, people are from all different ends of like the world and have very different identities. And I think that's where the interesting elements of the book kind of come through.
Yeah, I love that about it, the way that it sort of slowly unpicks in a world that's so determined to put people into boxes, and where identity can be such a powerful driving force for, you know, either political change or getting where you need to be. And then you sort of slowly deconstruct the boxes that people are in by making all these beautiful connections from all over the world. I wonder if now I could ask you each to do short reading from the book, just to give our audience a flavor of what's in it. And then we can dive more into those individual stories.
Cool. I'll go first because it's chronologically first in the book. So I'm going to tell you a bit about Peretta. And we included her story in the introduction because it was a very, we felt, useful story to lay out some of the themes of asylum seeking and deportation. So she migrated from the Gambia because of FGM, female genital mutilation, and she actually didn't want to share her story herself for a number of reasons, primarily shame and embarrassment, both culturally and also then because of the trauma that she's been through. But the second reason she didn't want to talk about her own personal story was because of or a direct result of the suspicious culture in the UK surrounding the asylum seeking process. So what she did want to speak about, however, was that process. So I'll read now. Peretta shared a story that exemplifies the instability and feelings of danger while seeking asylum. At certain stages within the asylum seeking process, either before a decision has been made or after a claim has been refused, asylum seekers may be asked to sign in with immigration officers as regularly as every week. In the UK, this might be in a police station or a branch of the Home Office, whichever is closest. At this appointment, asylum seekers are at risk of being detained suddenly and without warning. Detention can also happen at the homes of asylum seekers, again without warning, and most often at night or at dawn. Detention centres are essentially prisons where freedom of movement is limited. Most crucially, adults can be held indefinitely. These are not prisoners. These are people who have applied for asylum, had their cases considered and refused. Peretta had to sign in monthly at the police station, and this check-in caused a considerable amount of fear for Peretta and her friends. Once, Peretta went with a friend who needed to sign in. At the police station, her friend was suddenly arrested. Peretta was waiting for her, sitting on one of the benches. A police officer came over to her and said, "You can go home now. She's not coming out." Peretta kept asking the officer, "But why?" The officer repeated, "She is not coming back." A little while later, Peretta received a call from her friend. She asked if Peretta could bring her coat because she was freezing. Peretta brought her coat and some essential items. When she got to the station, she told the officer there that she was looking for her friend, but the officer told Peretta that she wasn't allowed to see her. Peretta said, "Even if I can't see her, can you give her her coat because she's freezing?" But the officers refused. But Peretta waited on the bench, refusing to be intimidated. She tells us, "That's just me. I'm not going to be scared off, even though I was scared." When they brought Peretta's friend down, she was handcuffed and she was crying. Peretta handed her her things. She tells us that until today, I don't know where she is. I don't know if she's been deported. I haven't got her contact details, and I can't forget about her. Every time I went to sign in, I would remember that. Even today, if I go past the police station, it's still in my mind. You cannot forget about them. Peretta heard rumours that her friend's application for refugee status had been denied, but Peretta asked, if she failed her asylum, is this the way they should treat her? She suggested that they treated her like she had killed somebody, like she was a criminal.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
It was a heck of a story to start the book with, and it's such a reminder of the sort of the very real impact of a hostile environment just being something that is a headline and a buzzword. And we're so familiar with the idea of hostile environment, but the idea of living in, having done nothing wrong and being forced to live in perpetual fear by design, it's meant to do that to her, is horrifying. Thank you for the reading. And now for you, Alex.
Thank you very much. The bit that I'm going to read is from the first chapter of the book, and it resulted from a discussion we had kind of in the making that if we were going to widen the definition of borders to invisible borders surrounding people's lives, then we should also include more stories than just kind of women's stories. If we're looking at how gender restricts a person's life, obviously that kind of stretches beyond women. So Alfare is a trans woman who is featured in our first chapter, and she's also, if any listeners live in London or London based, our launch party is on the 14th of December and we're fundraising for Alfare. So yeah, please do come along. And there's also a fundraiser for her online because she's currently living in a refugee camp in Kenya and wants to go back to university. Alfare loves basketball. She played the game in her hometown in Uganda, where she lived with her father. In fact, she was so good at basketball that she managed to study at university on a basketball scholarship. Alongside her studies, she also started up a cleaning company to make enough income. These are all the markers of a success story, someone who has come from a poor background with the smarts and the skills to educate themselves and make a better life. It is the kind of story we see retold in films, books, adverts, the universally appreciated bootstrap story. Except Alfare wasn't afforded this future. It is a future that she feels is held in suspension, waiting for her, endlessly delayed. I have my own dreams. I have my own career, she says over the phone, speaking from a reception centre at the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. She finds herself there because she left Uganda at the beginning of 2022 to find safety. She was facing persecution in Uganda because Alfare is transgender. Her own father wouldn't speak to her. A friend of hers said that if she travelled to Nairobi in Kenya and found a specific organisation that her friend knew about, she would be provided temporary accommodation while she entered into a resettlement process. But when she arrived, the organisation couldn't offer her accommodation or work. The only option left for Alfare was the refugee camp, Kakuma. She soon realised that this would be anything but the safe haven from persecution she was looking for. Intro.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and you do her story such justice. And for anyone who wants to contribute to the crowdfunder, the link is also on the event page. So if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll find the link for that. So chip on in. I want to you've given us a little flavor of the book. I wanted to dive a little further into the individual stories and how you chose to connect them. And I want to just, for anyone, the book is beautiful in writing, but it's also just wonderfully produced. And you have these beautiful images, chapter by chapter, that sort of bring these women alive on the page, that make you feel like you've met them because you can imagine them. I was wondering if you can tell us, so geographically diverse, you've touched on the fact that you're looking at refugees who are existing in camps, so already in that in-between space, settled in Dorset, people from Syria, from Western Sahara. You've got Ireland in there. So who were the people that made it into the book, and how did you decide how to connect these stories?
That's a really good question. I think we were trying to pull together stories that had similarities, and we did play around with it in the editing process with Lara, our amazing editor from Hurst. And I think one of the chapters that I think is really successful, actually, because of the kind of contrasts, but also connections between them, is the marriage contracts chapter. So this talks about, it's the stories of 4 women who all migrated primarily because of their husbands, but 3 of the stories are from the 1960s and from very different places, from St. Lucia, Nigeria, and I'm drawing a blank for some reason on the third. And then the more recent story is that of Ari, who grew up in Georgia during the Georgian Civil War, and then in 1994 went to Russia, where she met her husband, and then she came to the UK. And her story was particularly hard to write, actually, because when she was then in the UK, her husband began to abuse her, and so she had to seek asylum because she was on his visa. Anyway, I think that those stories particularly are because all 4 women had real struggles within their relationships, and found various freedoms of their own, but all had traveled because of their husbands. But I think the contrasts of where they came from and the time periods works really well as a kind of proposing the idea that this is a tale that has happened over and over again, regardless of nationality or time.
Yeah. Alex, did you want to?
I would say that kind of on the subject of how they're kind of grouped together and the parallels, I think it's what I'm excited to see is kind of with different readings of it, what different parallels kind of emerge for different readers. Because even I think when Lara sent back the first edits, I was really surprised where in the second chapter we've got the 3 stories. We've got kind of looking at Ireland, and then 2 to do with the Second World War, and from 2 incredible Jewish women. And she suggested grouping them together, which I just at first I was kind of like, well, that seems pretty random. Actually, there's this amazing thing where in the Ireland chapter, this amazing academic and activist, Camilla Fitzsimmons, speaks about the right to abortion and reproductive rights in Ireland, and how kind of women aren't allowed to kind of get abortions. And that's really interestingly aligned with one of the interviewees, Anka, who in the Second World War, she got pregnant in a concentration camp, and she was told if she carried her baby to term, the baby would be killed. And I think she would as well. And there's this interesting contrast between, in one place at a very different time, you've got women who are going to be punished for getting pregnant and wanting to get an abortion. And in another place, you've got a woman who's going to be brutally punished for wanting to carry that baby to term. And I think the contrast there is fascinating. And I never would have immediately put them together, but once you did, it really kind of brought out some interesting aspects about kind of, it doesn't matter the situation or the specifics, both of those women deserve rights to kind of choose how they carry through that. Yeah,
I think I was saying to Alex beforehand that reading it, it felt like there were echoes of so many of the experiences where it did feel like you could have paired them in different ways. And it was so interesting the way they had come together. And also fascinating as a reader who there is a lot of writing, quite necessary writing around borders at the moment. But the nuance and the intricacies of the way you approach borders, the way gender borders and boundaries our lives, the barriers that, you know, when you're looking at bodily autonomy, that would have applied as much to a trans woman's right to live her life fully and safely, to, you know, women being able to make those choices about having their child that they want or not carrying a pregnancy to term. And I thought it was really interesting the way you pulled those out to the surface. One of the other themes that carries across so many of these women is creativity. And you sort of observe that very consciously in the book, that creativity keeps cropping up in your interviews. Can you tell us a little bit about that and some of the creative women in the book?
I think that's fascinating you picked up on that, because originally in our original structure we had a whole chapter dedicated to creativity, with different stories from across the book in there, and then it actually worked out better to split them up. Yeah, so I think creativity. Oh, sorry, I'm just getting a charger. Sorry, Alex, do you want to take over?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, there are so many stories peppered throughout where the women use their creativity as a means of escape or exploring their feelings and their experiences, but we didn't need to kind of so purposefully name it in quite a lot of cases. But there is one part where I think the subtitle is Creation and Migration, and we really do center it because that's the life of Dorothy Bohm, who's a phenomenal woman. We absolutely loved meeting her, but she's an incredible photographer. I think she's been described as a doyen of British photography, and I think she's taken photos in 32 countries or something. But when we met her, she was 96, and we had kind of tea and cheesecake with her and her wonderful daughter. And she has had her fair share of kind of traumatizing life events, kind of losing family members in the Second World War and then not seeing them again for 20 years. But she completely defined every stage of her life by her changes in photography. So we were kind of waiting for this kind of dramatic life story. And she was like, then in 1982, I changed the color and I never looked back. And it was kind of a bit like, well, why are we focusing on this? And then it became obvious that was how she saw the world. That was her perspective. And it took us a second to clock that her perspective was so based on, I think, as she said it, being an outsider and a woman gives you this different way of seeing things from the outside. And her photography was her way of kind of communicating that, which was just, yeah, she's amazing. Yeah.
I love that story. Also, I think that if I can just follow up on that one, you mentioned in the book that the interview was you came with an idea of how you were going to do the interview, and she basically just held court and you had to just go with it. And so I connected to that. How was the interview approach in general? Going in, how much did you have a set idea of the questions you were going to ask and who the person was you were interviewing? And how much was it determined by just showing up and letting it sort of take shape however it would?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to that what I said at the beginning about we're not really the authors of this book so much as people that just showed up and listened and then wrote down what was said, because everyone's life story was so different. And you also can't, some of the interviewees Aminatou Haidar, for example, who's a Nobel Peace Prize nominee for her human rights work in Western Sahara, very media trained. She had a really clear idea of what she was going to say, but then we actually ended up having, as well as that, a really interesting conversation about her work within domestic spaces and her activism within domestic spaces. But a lot of the other stories, they're people that haven't necessarily ever told their stories, and they're telling them in front of family members, and they're really, a lot of the times we're covering a lot of incredibly difficult topics, and we never wanted to be people that were forcing difficult things to be said if it wasn't the right time or it wasn't the right place. So it was just the case of sitting back and letting people tell their story as they wanted to tell it, and just providing a space in which those stories could be heard, and within the book then just providing context so that readers could understand where their story was coming from. So yeah, so we were just more listeners, and we would prepare great swathes of questions and then go into an interview and toss it aside. Yeah, that was what was it was so lovely in the Dorothy interview to do that.
I think also as another reason that we were motivated just to kind of listen and let them define the parameters of conversation was because we're both very aware, and we've had conversations about the fact we're kind of two pretty privileged white women who have not had to go through any of these experiences. Well, most of them. And so it completely would be inappropriate for us to go in and be like, tell us about your trauma. Like that isn't ours to kind of demand. And it's up to the interviewee to tell us how much they wanted to, or decide how much they wanted to share with us. And actually, I think that worked because I think it largely created an atmosphere of kind of people feeling comfortable and feeling able to open up as well. Yeah, it
was nice seeing in sort of things rising to the surface. And so things like creativity, where it's sort of like, if you go in looking for that, it might not be immediately obvious, whether that was sort of the Jewish women in concentration camps, having art and making small pieces of jewelry as act of resistance, or I've there's so many incredible women, and their names are not on the tip of my tongue, but the woman from Georgia who, her first breakthrough in getting out of an abusive relationship and claiming a piece of independence was her painting, and being able to sell that, and then be able to, those are things that you couldn't possibly know ahead of time, that then how do you navigate then hearing these difficult stories in places?
On a personal level, do you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, we've cried in interviews, cried in writing up interviews. A lot of the stories are heartbreaking. I think the thing that kept us going is that they're really important stories to be told. Even, something as small as how to do the washing up in a camp in Iraq is as important as anything else. So I think the stories were more important than, that sounds wrong, but more important than our emotional well-being in the moment of writing the stories.
Right. Yeah.
I think also doing it together, like having to listen to the testimonies or subjects like that, it can be incredibly difficult. And I think around the same time I was working on an investigation for my job, which required lots of kind of meeting young women largely, and hearing their testimonies about sexual abuse. And quite often I was on my own when I was doing that, and would always be grateful when a colleague was there. And the difference between that and Alex and I doing these interviews together and kind of finishing the call and being like, and then kind of spending time together doing something daft and, like, I don't know, going for big glass of wine. that made it so much more bearable, I think. But also the stories, like there's a lot of trauma in them, but also each interviewee often talks so much about surprisingly joyful things, so you don't really feel left feeling kind of drained by it. You're actually kind of almost energized by it.
I think it's because it feels like a lot of political writing, in an effort to show how bad and how horrific, a border crossing might be, or life in, a refugee camp, or in being in a perpetual state of sort of living in a desert away from your land. And, in order to show how bad they are, they get stripped of the sort of the joys and the small things and those moments of levity, or just the reality of a life that is not perpetual misery, even if circumstance is really hard. And I think it made the book, I think, far more effective in that sort of humanity, because you then make those human connections, because we all have to do the laundry, and many of us, I think, would turn around and be like, how would I wash the clothes of my family if I suddenly if I had to do it with a bucket? And so it's a remarkable feat the way you put those in. One of the other recurring themes in the book for me was how many of these women seemed absent from the spaces where their circumstances were being decided. So whether that was the West African politician, and, these women were not at the table in UN peace talks to be able to decide their fate. Trans women, you document just how ever present they are in the UK media, never told from their own position, never in their own voice. Can you talk a little bit about maybe if you saw that or noticed that pattern in the research, or as you met these women, and if you have any ideas of how we might change that or rectify that, or whether it is changing that these women get to be at these tables more often?
I think what was very striking is the consequences of our interviewees not being included in these kind of decisions which directly impact them and their communities. It's kind of these very violent, misrepresentative policies kind of drawn up by people with no connection to those communities, without kind of proper research or understanding. And it's pretty horrific. And then and with regards to something, just when you're saying that, is I think Western Sahara is an example of the Polisario Front of incorporating more women into decision-making processes, which is incredible. But the consequences of them living through that is extraordinarily painful as well. For example, one of our interviewees, Omema Abdeslam, she was the Finnish representative of the Polisario Front, and she describes being sitting at a table with kind of Finnish politicians, but also Moroccan politicians. And the Moroccan politicians were saying in Arabic, I probably won't repeat it, but incredibly violent, sexually violent things towards her, thinking that the Finnish politicians didn't understand. And she says they did understand. They understood the anger and the violence behind what they were saying. And then they followed her home, carrying on saying these things. And I just can't imagine how difficult it must be to carry out your job effectively, kind of with that secondary layer of gender discrimination. So I guess it's kind of more marginalized communities of kind of women and trans people, for example, existing within those conversations, but when they get there, not being like continually I guess persecuted, even at the table.
Yeah, I think on an individual level, a lot of the stories we include are women advocating for themselves. So with the story of Najat, who was Syrian and was in a Syrian refugee camp, a lot in Iraq refugee camp. A lot of her coming to the UK was off her own work, and she led her family here through her work. And I think, again, like Dorothy's story, that she used her photography to let her husband go and do a PhD, and she was the breadwinner. So I feel like a lot of times as well, on an individual level, these women were massively advocating for and leading their own lives, but as a leader.
They all have that agency that is sort of denied them top down, and they just keep claiming. And I felt like that sort of agency was really beautifully captured in the sort of subtitle of the book, Tales of Transgression. Like they are doing that. I wonder if, connected to that, you could tell our audience a little bit more about Jessie, and a bit more about the chapter where you look at disability and the invisible women. So it's not just that not invited to the table, but they're just not out there in the world, deliberately invisibilized to the general public.
Yeah. So Jessie is someone I've worked with quite a number of years, and they're an extraordinary, amazing person. They've got a PhD in, I'm going to get the title wrong, but disability in the employment in the arts, I believe. And so they are just a complete font of knowledge on everything to do with disabled rights, and crucially, they are also disabled. They have cerebral palsy and are a wheelchair user. And so a lot of our conversations and a lot of our work together has been about the layers of borders within Jessie's life, and these it's such a sort of myriad of levels that you can kind of look at it from. So so there's the big geographical section of how does Jessie travel, and how does it work when they're in an aeroplane and they have to transfer out of their power chair into an aeroplane seat, but also then traveling around London on buses, on trains. And so much of the London transport system isn't accessible, and is really difficult to find space even on the in the allocated spaces, and there aren't straps in buses. So there's many flaws with the transport system on a big level on aeroplanes, and on a smaller level to do with public transport, but then also pavements, buildings. And but then our conversations kept on coming back to the domestic and the space that we were occupying a lot together, of how does Jessie move around their house, how do they get out of bed, and that requires funding from the government. So there's invisible borders there of, if Jessie isn't given funding, Jessie can't pay someone to help them. So that was that I found massively transformative in the way that one looks at borders, that there are these hugely different facets and hugely different levels which affect the day-to-day. And this then led to the rest of the chapter on invisible borders, which was looking at different people in cities mainly, and how different people occupy cities, and how, I suppose, the city creates the way that people occupy it, if that makes sense. Can you talk about that, Alex?
I think it's just interesting what you're saying, kind of those smaller journeys. And I think if you only define a migratory journey as from one country to another, you're automatically leaving so many experiences out of the conversation, and even kind of asking the question, well, why can't those people take those journeys? What's limiting them? And then let's also look at the journeys they do make, and how that those kind of seemingly smaller but equally important journeys are being made. And I think, cities are just such a fascinating kind of around the world, different cities and how they differ, how people travel around them, and how the governments of those countries transform how specifically women in the book, move around different cities. So we kind of looked at, did an amazing interview with Basma Khalifa, who's a filmmaker, and she made a BBC documentary called Inside the Real Saudi Arabia and Why I Had to Leave. And that's in Jeddah. But she really emphasizes how there's this kind of Western perception of like women in Saudi are controlled by men and the government, and they are second-class citizens. And, there's elements of that which are completely true. But there's also the other side of it, which is, the less patronizing narrative, which is let's speak to the views of the women actually living in those cities. And Basma said that the attitude there is kind of, it's the women upholding their own standards, which other people might see as kind of limiting on how they present themselves and move around these cities. And it was very much, if you're going to show up well, as Basma said, was the attitude of her aunts. And that kind of in contrast to then again in Hong Kong, looking at the female protesters and how they moved around the streets. And there's kind of this incredible freedom with women leading at the forefront of the kind of pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, but also the sexual violence they'd experienced once they kind of would be arrested. So yeah, I think looking at different cities and different kind of governments linked to those cities was very interesting.
And I think also the idea as well that borders are just made up things, that someone at some point decided. I mean, it's slightly different, I suppose, with the UK, with it's an island, but then again, there's still all the discussions about Scotland and Ireland. And I just think it comes back to why should a border that is implemented societally not be treated with the same weight as one that is more legalistically drawn in our world.
I'm going to open up to audience questions in a wee bit, so do stick them in the chat if you have them. I wanted to just pick up on that last point that you made, because one of the interesting points that came out of the book for me, when you look at the response of the UK population to the call for solidarity for Afghan refugees and for Ukrainian refugees. And I think you observe and create space for that idea that there's borders that are set by the state, and there's institutionalized borders, but there's also borders of mind and borders of culture, and that we get to determine how porous those borders can be. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you saw the distinction of how those refugee groups specifically, but the other ones you also mentioned, their experience of coming to the UK and how people responded to that?
Yeah, I think because on the one hand, I think it's amazing how the British public has responded and has potentially reframed some ideas about refuge and asylum seeking, and taken people into their homes. And I think on the one hand, that is an incredible thing to have happened. And I think that's quite revolutionary, the way in which the British population in many ways kind of forced the hand of the government. And yet on the other hand, it's the Homes for Ukraine was quite shocking in a way, just in how it contrasted a similar call that went out literally months before, after the fall of Kabul, for homes for Afghan people. And it definitely came across, and it was compounded with various other aspects of various politicians saying unsavory things about, we feel for Ukrainian people because they've got blonde hair and blue eyes, and massive overtones of racism in some of those comments. And I think there was also on the Ukraine border, there was pushback about who was being let through and who wasn't being let through. Sorry, I've lost my thread. But yeah, so it just came across as that people maybe, and I think that's kind of slightly the purpose of the book, it's that people felt that Ukraine was closer to home, and potentially their population was similar in colour to ours. And I don't know, I don't want to speak for anyone who did or didn't act, but perhaps that's what our book is trying to do, is in putting stories and faces and humanity to maybe stereotypes of a migrant or an illegal immigrant or an emigre. It's breaking down those borders of perception around who you would or wouldn't want in your home, or did that answer your question? Sorry, I don't think I did answer.
Yeah, no, I think so. Did you want to add anything, Alex?
No, I just think Alex is completely right. It's very much the idea of the diverse, deserving refugee, and who kind of is welcome and who's unwelcome. And I think there's kind of an absence of responsibility in the UK that kind of, I can't remember where I saw this, but it's the whole thing of we're here because you were there. You colonize these places, you had a devastating impact in so many countries around the world, and then have no responsibility or take no responsibility, and in fact make a hostile environment for people who are coming to a country which that connection was not made by the people in different countries. That was Britain's kind of responsibility. And I think there's a contrast between maybe the welcoming of Ukrainians, which again is wonderful, and so pleased that has happened in the UK, and it does show kind of a big step, but there's not that same responsibility whether it should be taken with other countries where there is a kind of great amount of violence and conflict.
So we have our first audience question, which is from Cal. How safe was it for some people to be interviewed, and did you have to leave anything out?
Yeah, a lot of the names have been changed, and details just slightly altered for anonymity's sake, and definitely for Alex Howlett's safety, because of her work with Al Jazeera, there were some bits that had to be removed or altered. So yeah, no, that was a massive priority for us, making sure that people would be safe and that there wouldn't be any pushback from having spoken to us. And we, as much as possible, just trying to be respectful of how people wanted their story to be told, but also how connected they would be to the story that they told. Thanks, Cal.
There's another one here from Saeed, which is, who is your reader? If you could put the book in the hands of anyone and know they were going to read it, who would that be?
Obviously everyone.
There's something for everyone. I think the usual kind of, it very much appeals to a kind of left-wing, what's it called? You're preaching to the choir. Is that the saying?
Yeah.
With aspects of this, where I think people we had in mind is we know who would pick up this book and be like, yeah, I agree with that. People with similar ideas around borders and migration and kind of countering xenophobia. But I think what we wanted to do was make it not too academic and not too inaccessible, which is why it's story-led, because it's meant to be more engaging and not too tricky, hopefully, to get through. So that, for example, if kind of someone with very different ideas might be tempted to pick it up and not feel instantly alienated from it, I might kind of give it to their kids for Christmas, and you kind of smuggle in some different ideas in there that might change some people's minds. I think that was something that we wanted to achieve.
Yeah, I agree. Everyone should read it. It's that a wonderful balance of being very rigorous and it's full of references, and also being very accessible, that you don't need to know the jargon around immigration systems or all of the different acronyms for UN bodies that work with refugees to be able to read it, which is refreshing and exciting as a bookseller, because you can put it in anyone's hands. We have another one from I apologize. I'm going to try and get your name right, which is Mr. Wenoferus, who says, it must have been hard to contact many of these individuals, especially as some are being scrutinized by legal systems. How did you go about getting in touch with someone like Aminatou?
We were put in touch with Aminatou by the Polisario, the ambassador, I think, as Polisario ambassador for the UK, and was it a deputy ambassador, Sidian. Yeah, he put us in touch with Aminatou. But yeah, it was, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, as you're saying, it was being put in touch with people who knew people. So instead of reaching out and kind of being like, hi, would you consider, I think, relying on these kind of safe communication channels through people they trusted made it a lot easier.
From Patrick, after the outpouring of solidarity for Ukraine, we hope that some things might change, but our government seems to just be getting worse. What do we do next?
Advocate for safe and legal routes to the UK. I mean, we talk about it a lot in the book, but, borders need to be broken down, and it's a bit of a pipe dream to kind of imagine a completely borderless world. But I think for safety and it just has to be safe and legal borders. You can only claim asylum in the UK if you're standing on British soil, unless you're coming to England via the Syrian resettlement route, the Afghan resettlement route, or the Ukraine resettlement route. Those are the three ways in which you can claim asylum. So if you're from basically anywhere else in the world, it's incredibly difficult to legally get to the UK to then be able to claim asylum and then to safely get to the UK. So I think we just really, really need to keep advocating for just safe routes to get to the UK and legal routes.
I think also kind of backing that up is one of our interviews with someone we met in Calais in the warehouse there, the distribution warehouse, made a good point that lots of the UK government's hostile environment policies were kind of, they were saying kind of to stop people smuggling and illegal activities around migration. But this woman we're speaking to in the distribution warehouse was like, they still exist. There is no lesser amount of smugglers and people trying to, sex trafficking around there. What would actually remove that was if there was, as you were saying, these safe and legal routes to passage, because their function would be no more. There wouldn't be a point to them. And it's so obvious. And obviously the government knows it's obvious that is the solution to stopping people trafficking.
There's a really interesting bit in the Revolting Prostitutes book by Juno Mack and Molly Smith that references that a lot of people smuggling and people trafficking that happens is people wanting to make journeys but are being pushed into less and less safe routes in order to make those journeys. So if we can provide safe routes and legal routes, that's...
Yeah, and it's illustrated in several of the stories in the book as well, the way the mechanisms that we have for people who have already arrived here make them precarious if they want to either leave an abusive workplace or leave an abusive partner, that we force them into making themselves illegal or staying in these awful situations. The mechanics of it are awful. As a bookseller and seeing so much creativity, and whether it was films that people were making about some of the women in the book or art that had come out of it, I feel a kernel of hope that books like this and conversations that are started by books like this make room for the humanity that people forget beyond headlines. Like, if we can get people to stop just long enough to see whole human beings, most of us would be really horrified. I think most people don't know how bad these experiences are. So thank you for putting it into the world. Speaking of the putting into it in the world, there are two questions. One from Soren that says, what were the mechanics of co-authoring? Who wrote what? And then Bella and John, who wrote, will you write together again? And if so, what about?
Co-authoring, dream. What a dream. For both of us, this is our first book. And I think, as Alex had said earlier, that it's so dreamy to have someone to call about either a tricky topic and just to have each other's backs. And also just the wisdom that comes out of Alex over there. I don't know where you are on the screen, but for me, you're over there. It is just phenomenal. It's awe-inspiring. And we'd have conversations where I love this bit that you've written, and Alex would go, I didn't write that. And I go, I didn't write that. So we've no idea who wrote what. It's plain to see. Yeah, what a dream.
I think I'm actually quite astonished at the moment because, like, yeah, it was our first book, but when we started writing, we were just like really close friends, and it felt like kind of being like, well, look at this really great friendship we have. Should we see if we can break it? Let's write a book together, because it is like such a scary, daunting, difficult thing to do alongside like work as well. And it didn't. It strengthened it, which is nice.
We'd have one really big explosive argument we could tell everyone about, but we didn't, unfortunately. And yes, I think, well, I would love to write a book again with Alex, but maybe a little while down the line, just to give us some our friendship some time off, so that we can just hang out at the pub again and not only having to be discussing whether or not we've done X, Y, Z. Yeah.
Some time just to exist in the celebration of this particular book.
Exactly.
It's so current that, you know, I mean, there's references to stuff that happens in 2022. So it's not that long ago that you let go of this baby to put it into the hands of a publisher, to put it into the world.
I know, it already feels out of date though. I shouldn't say that, but as in, the world of politics is moving so fast that, you know, if we're referencing Priti Patel, it's now everything's moved on already. But I think that's, you know, necessarily, some of the stories are completely timeless. Don't worry.
Yeah. I think very much timeless in that, you know, those human stories that don't get told and don't get spotlighted, and the fact that they span, you know, that geography, time, people who, you know, came here in the 60s and people who are making that journey today. You know, it's not all about right this moment. I don't have any other questions coming through on the chat, and we have just a couple of minutes left. So I wanted to ask you, we do a series in the shop of video interviews called Read, Think, Act, and the idea is very much about making those connections between, you know, you read a book and you get exposed to ideas, and then you have to make the choice to digest those ideas, and then what do you do with that? And you handily in the book finish with a what do we do with this? And it's quite short and sweet. And I wonder if each of you could maybe pick out one or two things that come up in that end bit to send people off into the world to do.
Yeah, we could decide, instead of we thought a conclusion would just end up full of sort of platitudes, and because we felt like we'd said everything already. No, so we decided to make a list of what people can do, and ways in which they could, you know, as you said, activate their thinking. One of my favorite tips from that list was just asking about accessibility at events you're holding. And it's remarkable how small an effort that is from your part or my part. We did it for, it's really difficult to find accessible places to hold book launches, and we certainly found that on our organising this one, and then we asked the place where we were holding the book launch about accessibility, and they responded with, we haven't got a ramp, but we'll immediately get one. So they've got one for us for the book launch, which is one of those things which is, it feels really exciting that you know that you've made a difference to potentially anyone who's going to their next, and you've made someone think about something that they hadn't necessarily considered, and it's not, you know, through any malice of their actions, it's just an omission. Yeah, so I think that one, just asking, you know, asking for captions, asking about the accessibility of a place, just getting people to think about how inclusive they are with their spaces, with their events, with their buildings. Yeah.
Love that. What about you, Alex? One or two things?
Just one, I reckon. I just thinking there's all the obvious stuff, like, yes, most of us can't shape the actions of governments. That is where most of the power lies, but there are so many grassroots organizations and charities and opportunities to get involved in kind of community organizing, which does have a massive impact on people living in communities across the UK and obviously beyond. But I also think something very doable, because all of us kind of have jobs and busy lives, and for those of us who don't have that time to commit, I think it's just chatting. Like, I think outside of your usual kind of friends and family, talking to strangers and being friendly and listening to people often just changes your mind about things so easy, and it's such an easy thing to do. Like, I remember my mum coming up to London once on the bus, and she sat at the front of the bus and started talking to the bus driver as he was driving. I was like, no, don't do that. No, it's Solvish, not from London. And but she chatted to him for like half an hour or something, the whole journey. And he really opened up about his life. And I was watching, I was like, oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe that's actually quite a nice thing to do. But I think just speaking to as many different people as possible, and kind of changing your mind on things through conversation. And I think if enough people do that and make that extra effort, it kind of reaches people in power eventually, or kind of has the not trickle down, trickle up effect, maybe. I mean, it's a long shot, but it's very accessible. It's an easy thing to do.
Yeah. I think I love that, the sort of making friends as like the opening gambit of what next, that sort of like reaching out, that is like, again, with so many of these things, it's we can be so paralyzed by the big things that we couldn't possibly change. But if you make one person's day better, or somebody who started with a shitty day because somebody has said something that has made them feel small or unwanted, and you get to be part of turning that day around, like, that's good enough for a Tuesday, you know. And so for anyone who's watching in Edinburgh, there's organised fun in the form of the wonderful humans at the Welcoming, who could really do with, they welcome people in for conversation class, to like chat groups, and it helps like new Scots to practice their English and meet new people and get out in the world. And Refuwigi in Glasgow puts postcards to welcome new refugees from people. So you can just write a postcard to a complete stranger, welcoming them to Scotland and telling them a little bit about something here, and they put it in these bags, and it's just wonderful. And so it's great to see that idea of these human beings that we can connect with, and the trickle up is right through this extraordinary book. One of the other things you can do is buy the book and gift it to all your friends and enemies and your local MP.
Yeah.
And everyone else. You can bang people on the head with this beautiful book that makes a beautiful gift, but also I think is genuinely the kind of read that can change hearts and minds and really equip people to navigate a tricky world in a better way. So that leaves me to say thank you all for tuning in online and for your questions and contributions. And a very big raise a glass, put your hands together in whatever nerdy way at home to say a very big thank you to Alex and Alex for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Oh my God, thank you. What an honor. Mari, for your amazing and insightful questions. Yeah, real pleasure to be here.
It was an honor. I am now going to cut the live stream. So all of you at home have a wonderful rest of the night and get in touch and leave any final thoughts